Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Alam and Jackie Hour. I'm not really sure what the full proper title of this podcast is, but it's your favorite guest speaker, Miss Baker. Today, I'm getting them started with the Russian Revolution. And I'm not going to focus on the events in 1917 just yet. What I am going to focus on is an event called, I'm not going to say focus. I'm going to start by talking about Bloody Sunday. This happened on January 22nd, 1905, when a large number of workers marched to the Tsar's palace because Russia was a monarchy, just like other countries have had monarchies, except for their name for king is Tsar. So all these workers, large number of workers, marched to the palace, and they presented a petition for better working conditions, and it was not met very kindly. They were fired upon by the soldiers. Many of them were killed, many of them were injured, and this day became known as Bloody Sunday. Now, before Bloody Sunday, the peasants and the working class people actually revered the Tsar and thought that he was on their side, and they blamed their troubles on other parts of the government, other functions of the government, but kind of left the Tsar sort of free of blame. But that day really changed everything when they realized that the Tsar himself was no different than other members of the government. Now, that was in 1905, and the working class people and the peasants of Russia had been living in very difficult conditions for decades before that. They had little pay. They often went without food. There was no real government agency that protected them from dangerous working conditions. Honestly, they were mostly treated like slaves. And this had been going on for decades. And then the events of Bloody Sunday in 1905 didn't make anything any better. And then they were drafted into World War I. And although they had a very large army, they didn't have proper clothing. They didn't have proper shoes. They were not fed enough food. And so the soldiers who were asked to be in this war, which was a horrible war for any soldier to be in, but then to not be properly equipped or trained to fight led to a lot of resentment, which then led to the Russian Revolution after the war, when the soldiers, I don't want to say returned, because the war was still happening. The war did not end until 1919, but this happened during that. And so there were two major revolutionary events that we kind of call the Russian Revolution. The first is the February Revolution, and the second was the actual Bolshevik Revolution. So the February one happened in February, and then there was another one that happened in October of 1917, and that's actually when Lenin took control.
Hi there, it's Jackie. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the rule was under Tsar Nicholas II. The people were split up into two groups of people. It was the serfs and the noblemen. The serfs made up 80% of the people living in poverty, and the noblemen made up 20% of the rich people. This is important because the February Revolution of 1917 was a multitude of workers that decided to strike and would gather together to discuss politics and then go as far as to riot against Nicholas II. Obviously, Nicholas II couldn't have riots, especially as he was the one in command, but more and more riots would continue to happen, and he'd have to order his army to try to stop the riots, but many of the soldiers would refuse to fire upon the Russian people and begin to mutiny against the Tsar. After more riots continued to occur, the army went as to dethrone Nicholas, and the government would be made up into two parts after his dethroning. It would be the Petrograd and the Provisional Government. The Petrograd Soviets were the representatives for the workers and soldiers, and the Provisional represented the government without the Tsar.
So basically, for a while, Russia would be ruled by these two groups, which were the Petrograd and the Provisional Government. And the main group of the Petrograd, which was called the Bolsheviks, was led by Vladimir Lenin. Vladimir Lenin wanted the Russian government to be a communist government. So in October of 1917, he took control of the government in what became the Bolshevik Revolution and created the Soviet government, which basically concluded the Russian Revolution. And Vladimir Lenin created the communist Russia, which was the first communist country in the world. Can you tell us a little bit about the Russian Revolution?
Absolutely. So what winds up happening is that you have a few factions. I mean, there's a lot of factions, but primarily we focus on the Red Army and the White Army. Okay, so for the Red Army, initially begins with the Bolsheviks. They're a group that are primarily led by Vladimir Lenin, sort of propagating communist propaganda, first initiated by Karl Marx. So the big aspect for why there's this big communist revolution or even takeover comes as a result of the unpopularity of World War I in Russia. So when Russia pulls out of the war, and after Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne, this leaves this sort of spiral of what is going to avoid, I should say, of what's going to fill in the new system for these Russian people. So you have a lot of competing factions. So you have these sort of imperial loyalists who are kind of loyal to the old guard, to the Tsar. This is what we call the White Army, okay? And then you have Lenin's crew, which is going to evolve from the Bolsheviks into eventually the Soviets, full-blown Soviets. And eventually guys like Leon Trotsky, who's Jewish, are going to step into the scene and take over. They're going to be the figureheads. And so there's this predominant view that the Communist Party, from the Bolsheviks all the way to the Soviets, the Red Army, are predominantly Jews. And there is some Jewish involvement. But we have to understand something. Between the Red Army and the White Army, there are these pogroms, sort of persecutions, killing programs of the Jewish people. Both the White Army and the Red Army engage in this, even though at the time Leon Trotsky is going to be the head of the Red Army. Eventually, and you're going to see even amongst the Jewish population in Russia, other major groups. We're going to have what we call these partisan political parties begin to emerge. They all have different viewpoints. So what winds up happening is the Red Army will eventually call quits on these pogroms, on sort of these anti-Semitic displays. And this is predominantly why people think that the Bolsheviks and the Red Army predominantly Jewish, is because they sort of stop these killings, they stop this discrimination against Jewish people, and sort of seeing a lack of better options, I suppose. Because if you were Jewish and you happen to subscribe to communism, you don't really believe in the Jewish faith. You sort of cast all religion to the side. That's what happened with Leon Trotsky. So you have these two major competing factions, and the one that's going to be the least discriminatory is going to be the one that's going to gain the most followers. And this is what ultimately is going to win out for the Red Army versus the White Army, and this competition of what is going to be the new political and governmental structure of Russia post-1917 with the Bolshevik uprising.
Thank you.
This sums up our show. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for more. Thank you.